Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a very recent book by Alex Wellerstein entitled Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States, published in April by the University of Chicago Press. Joining us for the discussion today will be Kathleen M. Vogel and Matthew Connolly. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I'm co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my longtime colleague, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center since pandemic restrictions here in the virtual realm. And we have a continuing lineup of sessions still ahead of us this season that'll carry us into July, including one this coming Monday, May 17th at 4 p.m., when we discuss Joan Meyerowitz's just published book, A War on Global Poverty, The Lost Promise of Redistribution, and the Rise of Microcredit. So please join us for that session as well as today's. Today's session is being co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project and its Nuclear Proliferation International History Project. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. We'd like to thank our financial supporters, those who help us out with the seminar, both anonymous and not anonymous. And as always, we invite you to join their ranks. Information about doing so can be found in the chat function. On the logistics front, you should know today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. Those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is posted in the chat function. And we'll try to call on as many folks as we can. And with that business out of the way, I turn the screen over to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian, Zoom room is all yours.
Great, thanks, Eric. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to be introducing our three speakers, really terrific panel focused on Alex Wellerstein's new book, Restricted Data. Let me first introduce Alex and then the others, Kathleen and Matt, in turn. Alex Wellerstein is a historian of science and nuclear technology. He's a professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, where he's the director of the Science and Technology Studies in the College of Arts and Letters. His first book, Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States, published, as Eric just mentioned, just last month by the University of Chicago Press, is the first attempt at a comprehensive history of nuclear weapons. It's the first attempt at a comprehensive history of how nuclear weapons ushered in a new period of governmental and scientific secrecy in the United States. His writings on the history of nuclear weapons have appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic Magazine, Harper's Magazine, the Washington Post, and many other venues, and this includes the Wilson Center's a number of events that Alex has participated in as part of our Nuclear Proliferation International History Project. His online nuclear weapon effects simulator, NukeMap, has been used by over 25 million people globally and is a fantastic resource that we continue to congratulate Alex on. Now we have something else to congratulate him on, his new book, and he'll be talking about it now for about 15, 20 minutes or so. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christian, Eric, the National History Center. This is a great honor. And I want to preemptively thank Kathleen and Matthew for agreeing to do this. This is really quite a lot of fun. I'm not going to give some long talk, but since I assume that most of the people on this webinar have not read the new book, I'm going to just briefly give an overview of the sort of structure of the book and what it's about, and then some of what I see as the major arguments of the book, and then we can open it up more broadly to Kathleen and Matthew. The biggest argument of the book is that nuclear secrecy can be historicized, that it has a history, that it is not some sort of natural or static condition that just sort of arose and then continued, but it had a beginning and it has a lot of stuff going on, and sort of determining whether it got made into a institution to begin with, and it may not have an end. I don't know, but that's it certainly has a structure to it. And so to that end, the book is broken into three major parts. The first part goes from the self-censorship of scientists just before World War II begins, who are the ones who first have the possibility of nuclear weapons in mind after the discovery of nuclear fission. This self-censorship, through a variety of twists and turns, morphs into a sort of civilian censorship, which is run by civilian scientific organizations, and then eventually becomes taken over by the military as part of the Manhattan Project, the wartime effort to build nuclear weapons. And the Manhattan Project secrecy, of course, is very vast and is very famous. But one of the things that I think the book does a job of trying to emphasize is that most of the people involved in it thought that secrecy would be temporary, and that it was not as absolute as they perhaps desired it to be. It was perhaps impossible for it to be as absolute as they desired it to be. And part one finishes by talking about the plans made that were made by people within the Manhattan Project to release certain amounts of information about the bomb, what they called publicity, after the first use of the bomb, which was the first instance in which they had to very carefully manage what was going to be let out and what was going to be kept in, and what criteria should be used to determine between the two. Part two of the book looks at what happens in the sort of post-war to Cold War period. So the bomb has been used, the war has ended, what now? This follows debates within US policy over sort of the legal ramifications of nuclear weapons and their secrecy. It also looks at discussions that scientists, including former Manhattan Project members, had about whether or not secrecy was going to have a deadening effect on science, whether or not it made any good political or strategic sense, and whether there were alternatives, such as the international control of atomic energy as a non-secretive approach to controlling nuclear weapons. And it covers the creation of the Atomic Energy Act, which is where the title of the book comes from. Restricted data is the legal category in the United States for nuclear weapon secrets. And it is a special legal category and a parallel secrecy system to the rest of American national defense secrecy. So for me, it's a very apt term to use, both because restricted data sounds to somebody who doesn't know it like a good term for secrecy, but also because this is one of the strange and unusual hallmarks, and again, very historicized, a product very much of its times. And I try to sort of show how those times produce this bizarre legal category, which is set up quite differently from many other sorts of secrecy. It goes on to look at attempts within the Atomic Energy Commission to reform secrecy. The people who were initially running the nuclear complex were not really big fans of secrecy, but they found that it was politically difficult for them to, even from the inside, change the fundamental operations of the system. These attempts at reform came to a sort of a jarring halt in 1949 and 1950 with the detonation of the first Soviet atomic bomb, the debate over whether to build the hydrogen bomb, and the revelation in 1950 that the Manhattan Project had been penetrated by many Soviet spies. This part of the book ends with the establishment of the sort of Eisenhower-era Cold War approach to nuclear secrecy, which along with all of the things that we would associate with that, McCarthyism, fear of scientists, lots of fear of secrets getting out, things like that, fears of enemies both on the outside and on the inside of the United States nuclear complex, also had the peculiarity of being very pro civilian nuclear power. And so took on what I sometimes call a sort of bipolar approach of either nuclear information is so secret that you could be executed for giving it away, or it is so beneficial to the public good that everybody should have it in the entire world. Part three looks at what happens with this Cold War regime as the Cold War sort of matures over the 60s, 70s, and even through the end of the Cold War. First, by looking at challenges to this regime in the form of gas centrifuges, laser fusion, and fears of nuclear terrorism. So these are incidences that the existing Cold War framework for thinking about secrecy could not very well handle and adapt to, and yet somehow muddled through nonetheless. And then it looks at the rise of anti-secrecy in the 1970s and 80s. So this is a sort of a philosophy, a political ideology that sees secrecy itself as the enemy. And there are antecedents of this even in the 40s, but by the 70s with the the Pentagon Papers, Woodburn-Bernstein, Watergate, this sort of turns into a political force in and of itself. And it ends by looking at the Progressive case in 1979, which was a sort of legal test of the restricted data clause that eventually more or less failed for the government to uphold this specialness. And then finally, it looks a little bit at what happens at the end of the Cold War, where there are attempts to reform the secrecy once again that had some successes, but ultimately the secrecy regime maintains its power, and we still live within this essentially Cold War secrecy regime. So that's the sort of structure of the book. And the conclusion talks about some other things and hypotheticals, and we can get into those if we want to. The bigger arguments, or maybe the smaller arguments to the book, other than the fact that nuclear secrecy has a history, are things like the fact that nuclear secrecy was always controversial. There was never a time period, including during World War II, where everybody just was completely on board with the idea that secrecy was a valid way to try and control the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And it always emerged from very specific historical circumstances. So it is, again, not natural, it is not inevitable, but it's about specific historical forces and sometimes specific historical people operating at specific times and places. And the book tries to, elaborate on what those are. It also argues that secrecy really shouldn't just be seen as a binary of either sort of secrecy or non-secrecy or secrecy and openness, but changing attitudes, practices, outcomes, and including the idea that the release of information, especially the selective release of information, can be just as political and powerful an act, and is one that is often wielded by the censors as well as the act of restricting information. A lot of the book also argues that in the American context in particular, nuclear secrecy is always in tension with core national values, cultural values, governmental values, and priorities. There's always a tension there. It's what makes the United States such an interesting case for me for nuclear secrecy. If we were talking about the Soviet Union, it would be a really different story. If we're talking about the People's Republic of China, really different story. But because we're talking about the United States, you have real tensions with the First Amendment. You have real tensions with expectations of transparency and open government. And these tensions produce really interesting historical, I think of them as monsters, but grindings and strange phenomena that are in some ways, I think, unique to the American experience. And lastly, again, nothing about the American nuclear secrecy system should be taken for granted as natural or obvious. It is entirely a product of historical circumstances and often individual minds. Finally, if I were just going to say what I found to be the most difficult and maybe intellectually interesting part about writing this book and sort of trying to tell this story, it was in finding a voice for the censor. We don't usually think of the censor as somebody who needs a voice because they're a powerful person, and we usually like to give voices to the voiceless and things like that. But ironically, the censor doesn't usually get to tell their side of the story. Those of us who are on the outside of a secrecy system only see the products of the censorship. We see the deletions, we see the pages denied, we see later the secrets that were held back. But we rarely can reconstruct the mind of the person who did it. We tend to come up with sort of stereotypes or evil villain tropes or power-hungry bureaucrats. And in the book, I try to really find these people and find their notes and see their handwriting and see the debates that they were having behind the curtain of secrecy, the same debates and uncertainties that were being held on the other side, except that because they were behind the curtain of secrecy, that secrecy kept those debates secret as well. And so ironically, one of the conclusions I came about the history of secrecy is that the voices of the critics of secrecy are the easiest to find. They're everywhere. They're in newspapers, they're in op-eds, they're loud and very angry. But the voices of the defenders, the internal defenders of secrecy, or at least the operators, not necessarily the defenders, those are the ones that took a lot of historical and archival work to resurrect. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you so much again. I'm really pleased to be here.
Thanks, Alex. Great. Thanks for being so succinct. We have two very distinguished scholars to launch us into our discussion that I hope will include many of you in the audience. We'll start with Dr. Kathleen Fogel. Dr. Fogel is professor and deputy director at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on socio-technical assessments of biosecurity threats. Her work has also studied knowledge production and weapons assessments in US intelligence and collaboration between academia and the intelligence community. Previously, she served as a William C. Foster Fellow and as a Jefferson Science Fellow at the US Department of State. And we at the Wilson Center are very proud to call her an alumna. She was with us as a fellow in 2011, 2012. She holds a PhD in biophysical chemistry from Princeton University. Her publications, or many publications, include Phantom Menace or Looming Danger, a new framework for assessing bioweapon threats, published by Johns Hopkins in 2013, and several articles, including Interdisciplinary Cross-Sector Collaboration in the US Intelligence Community, Lessons Learned from Past and Present Efforts, published in Intelligence and National Security in 2019, Bringing the National Security Agency into the Classroom, Ethical Reflections on Academia Intelligence Agency Partnerships in Science and Engineering Ethics, and Tacit Knowledge, Secrecy, and Intelligence Assessments, STS Interventions by two participant observers, published in Science, Technology, and Human Values in 2018. It's wonderful to have you back, so to speak. Kathleen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Christian, for that really nice introduction. And it's also just such a pleasure to be here at this Wilson Center event. I've long followed Alex's work with great interest and was so excited to hear about his new book coming out, just to have this opportunity, just to have a chance to read it when it's just hot off the press. And Alex and I have a lot of synergies in terms of our shared research interests in the area of secrecy and national security. And Alex's book looks at the different secrecy regimes and practices around the American nuclear complex, and a lot of my own work, as Christian briefly mentioned, has been interested in looking at the effects of secrecy on the American and Soviet biological weapons programs. And so it was really interesting to read through his book to see some of the similarities, but then also differences in terms of how these different weapons programs sort of handled and thought about secrecy and classification issues. So I found that fascinating. So what I thought I'd do is just provide a few things that really jumped out at me as I read through Alex's book, and then I'll definitely have a very interesting question to pose Alex for a conversation afterwards. So I think one of the great things that Alex's book does is to open up this black box of secrecy around the US nuclear program, for looking at its origins all the way up to the present day. And what I think his strength as a historian is to be able to get access to very unique archival and historical materials to really try and get at what structured secrecy and classification issues in the American nuclear complex, and looking at sort of the whole host of different actors that were involved in this, but also looking at sort of the construction of different kinds of technologies, sites, institutions, and different kinds of practices that had to be created to make this secrecy system work in the real world. So, he looks at sort of, again, things that we might take for practice, for granted, those of us who might have followed sort of secrecy or intelligence issues, things like those secret or top secret kind of stamps, those had to be created. Then, these whole things related to need to know policies, how you do clearances and background checks on folks, different kinds of physical security systems that you had to construct for these technologies. Different issues around censorship and sort of how you might think through that, what needed to be censored and maybe what was left out. And then even things like enrolling far-flung Pacific Islands, sort of all these things were critical to the US secrecy system around nuclear weapons. And what Alex shows powerfully through his careful attention to detail with this kind of historical analysis is that the past was not necessarily fixed, and that there was not really one way to think about secrecy around nuclear weapons. Rather, what Alex shows is that there were many different people inside and outside the government, as well as different kinds of US government cultures that were having debates in this mix, different circumstances, different political factors. and also different sets of enemies as well as allies that shape the secrecy regimes and practices around US nukes. And that these things were all very contingent. They fluctuated, they were contested and negotiated over time. And that, as you read through the different chapters of his book, you see there are a lot of both contradictions and tensions inherent in these regimes and practices. I think Alex also usefully shows how secrecy was also not only used to protect nuclear information, so it wasn't necessarily used as sort of a security practice, to prevent things from going to our enemies, but also sometimes for other reasons, such as for managerial or organizational control of employees, essentially to keep them on task and focused on sort of the mission and the project. And he also talks about in other cases, it was to keep information from congressmen so that they would not scrutinize and question these huge budgetary expenditures for this new unproven weapons system back at the origins of the US nuclear program. And he also very usefully shows that from the very beginning of the US nuclear program, there are various deliberations that emphasize the dangers of overclassification, even while at the same time recognizing that we all needed to secure some things within the US nuclear program. There was always this tension of what was too much classification. And I think that's useful to think about. And so what Alex's book illustrates is that there was not really one way to think about the security of nuclear knowledge or nuclear weapons. And even scientists working within inside the nuclear complex and contributing to this mission had very different opinions about what that should be. And in covering this contingency, Alex's book really asks us to think about, possible alternative futures, really help us to imagine how might we have secured our nuclear weapons sort of in other ways. And also it kind of brings this more contemporary sort of question, how we might want to go about either reforming maybe, or radically changing our ways of doing classification around these technologies, or if we're thinking about other kinds of emerging technologies that we're concerned about, how we might think about secrecy and classification around those things as well. His book also asks us to usefully consider what exactly is dangerous information or dangerous knowledge. Is it sort of things like the diagram for the H-bomb, which he goes into a lot of detail in one of his chapters in his book, or is dangerous information, dangerous knowledge kind of more complicated than that? For example, does dangerous knowledge involve aspects of embodied knowledge, what one might more commonly refer to as know-how, which is more difficult to acquire and transmit than through mere pieces of paper or digital means? And I think the Klaus Fuchs case that he talks about in his book provides a useful example around this. And also that in the Fuchs case, Alex sort of talks about how the Russians didn't wholly trust this information that was being transmitted from Fuchs because it was considered secret, and so therefore could have been part of a double agent campaign to feed Soviet misinformation. So again, Fuchs's passing of secret American nuclear information, I think Alex's book sort of talks about, didn't really ultimately accelerate the Soviet bomb program as much as people thought. So I think, again, it's useful to kind of tease out and uncover these interesting facets of American history. And so, how do we think about dangerous knowledge? What exactly does it take to design and actually build a workable or even a crude nuclear weapon? How you answer that kind of question has far-reaching implications for not only how we might secure our own nuclear weapons or nuclear complex, but also how we might go about trying to acquire intelligence about another country's or non-state actors' nuclear ambitions. And I think Alex's book does a great job in looking at the historical record to try and sort of get at some of these very difficult kinds of questions. Alex's book also illustrates these fundamental tensions in how we think about, this need to control the diffusion of scientific and technological knowledge involved in producing weapons. And it gets at these kind of inherent questions about, do we keep science open as much as possible in order to basically enable better science for national security, for economic progress, for progress of American society in general? Or do we really need to clamp down on certain kinds of science and control it in certain cases? And what might be the costs and detrimental effects in doing that? These are kind of similar tensions that I've seen in terms of my own work with developments in genetic engineering, how there's the potential, to develop those technologies for all kinds of very beneficial medical advances, but at the same time, some of those advances could also create new and more lethal forms of biological weapons. And And what you see is that the biological and life sciences community and the US national security establishment are still struggling to answer these fundamental kinds of questions about how much to keep science open. And Alex's book really helps open up this whole sort of question of how we think about science and openness, and how we might think about it in these more contemporary debates. So that was just a quick summary of some things that I found really fascinating about Alex's book. What I want to do is kind of throw out just one question for you to kind of think about, and we can come back to it whenever it might be convenient. And it's sort of this issue of thinking about this long arc of the history of secrecy from the origins of the US nuclear program kind of to the present. And your book does a really great job of sort of following that arc and that trajectory. And at least from, reading the book and sort of reflecting on it, it seemed to me that this history seems to suggest that although there might be challenges to secrecy regimes and the practices that you sort of describe in your book, that it seems like secrecy and classification always wins in the end, and that little has changed since the end of the Cold War. There always seems to be kind of a new enemy that sort of justifies the existing security regime or intensifies it in some way. And it gets to this issue of fear, which in one of your chapters, you sort of talk about how the origins of nuclear secrecy lay in fear. And so it's this fear that's this driver, this motivator for these kinds of practices in these regimes. So I guess my question to you is, again, after writing this book and kind of reflecting on this history, does secrecy always win in the end? What would you say to that question, and why or why not? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. And kind of related to that, what would you say to the folks who are in the fight against secrecy, who are really trying, for democracy, for increasing transparency and openness in American society, who want to open that up? What would you say to those folks? Is there a way out of this just dilemma? And sort of through your book, what does your book kind of have to say about that issue? So that I'm going to throw out that one question. I definitely have others that I'd be curious to ask, but I'll just kind of throw that one out there to start with.
Great. Alex, feel free to respond, and we can go back and forth a little bit if you'd like. Alex?
That's great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And your work has been very helpful for me. I'm glad that mine is helpful for you as well. But I do think that moving between the context of nuclear, biological, and I've looked a bit at computer science, that it does help you see what's specific to the technology and what's sort of a more generic epistemological situation. This is a really great question. Does secrecy always win? I think the answer doesn't have to be yes, but like with all things, once you have a very large powerful infrastructure, it's very hard to undo it. Once you have a system, it's hard to undo real systemic change. And so there were, I think, instances, say in the 1940s, where you could imagine having set up a very different system. Now, these many decades on, it's very hard to imagine a total dismantlement of that system without a dismantlement of the overall system that encases it. And so one of the, I use this line semi-facetiously in the conclusion, but because it's a riff off of another line that's famous. There's a famous quote, which is, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, which is attributed to a lot of different people, interestingly enough. Like there's no clear thing who said that, but it's a very clever quote. And so I say, in some ways, it's easier to imagine the dismantlement of nuclear weapons, the abolition of them, than it is to imagine getting rid of nuclear secrecy. And that's because we built up our way of thinking and interacting with them around secrecy. But to your second question, which is maybe a more optimistic answer, right? To what do you say to reformers? And it's don't try to dismantle the whole secrecy system. You probably won't be able to. That would require a sort of real revolution in thinking by a lot of people, and it's not going to happen likely anytime soon. Not without some major, maybe at the end of the Cold War, you could imagine that people might have gone that direction, but we would have had to have a massive realignment of sort of powers. But there are ways to make things better in the world. And so my recommendation is always parse out specifically the practices that are the most harmful and the ones that you can actually imagine taking issue with. If the issue is, really nasty background investigations, change how those work. If the issue is scientists can't publish on a certain topic, you can sometimes get them to be able to publish on that topic. That sort of stuff is possible. And I was just thinking recently about how much the difference has been There was a nice article in the New York Times about police body cameras and the real differences between places that have laws that require them to be sort of instantly released to the public and the ones that it's a huge, long, difficult, incredible, hard way to get them released. That's a real systemic difference, right? That level of secrecy versus output. And I'm not saying which side of those one might want to fall on from a public policy standpoint, but that's the kind of practice that maybe looks a lot smaller than secrecy, but is actually really core to the sort of lived effect and day-to-day sort of interactions. And so my recommendation to reformers is don't just rail against secrecy. That's fine, you can do that. It can be a powerful way to do it, but focus on exactly what it is that's the problem, because not all of it's as maybe urgent as other parts of it.
Great, thank you so much. So Christian, I'll turn over to you. I know because we do have another panelist and questions
Sure.
probably from the audience. So I'll definitely come back later, but happy to turn with you.
Very good. Well, then this is actually perfect setup for our next commentator, what Alex just said. Matthew Connolly, who is a professor of international and global history at Columbia. Matt is the co-director of the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy and principal investigator of History Lab, a National Science Foundation funded project to apply data science to the problem of preserving the public record and accelerating its release. His publications include A Diplomatic Revolution, Algeria's Fight for Independence and the Origins of the Post-Cold War Era, which won 5 prizes, including the George Louis Baer Prize of the American Historical Association, and Fatal Misconception, the Struggle to Control World Population, an Economist and Financial Times Book of the Year, which he wrote at least in part at the Wilson Center, if I recall correctly, where he was a fellow in 2006-2007. His current book project, to be published by Random House, is titled The Declassification Engine. Matt has written research articles in the Annals of Applied Statistics, Comparative Study in Society and History, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the American Historical Review, and Past and Present. He's also provided plenty of commentary on international affairs for the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times, Washington Post, Le Monde, and has hosted documentaries for BBC Radio. Matt, also welcome back and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much, Christian. I'm just delighted to be part of this. I too have been following Alex's work for some years now. I remember reading his dissertation and thinking this is one of the only dissertations I've ever read that I thought could have been published as is, with no further editing, which is really quite rare. But I'm very grateful, that Alex continued to work at this immensely important and challenging subject, because the book is even better. I mean, it's really quite amazing, and it's a major accomplishment. I'm not unbiased here. I think the subject is incredibly important. I've been working at this for a few years myself. I hope members of the audience, if they're part of this discussion, it's because they recognize that the fact that we only know, what the government will allow us to know about matters of great public import is a critical problem, for constitutional and democratic governance of our society. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact it's had on historical scholarship, because I think that matters too in the very long run. Even if you don't care about these things, some people still care about things like nuclear proliferation. So in all these ways, I think Alex's work is really profoundly important. I also want to say, and this is where we start to talk about the field of history to which he's contributing. This isn't just the first archive-based history of nuclear secrecy. As near as I can tell, this is the first archive-based history of secrecy, of state secrecy, at least in the United States. I think that's astounding. After all, as Alex shows, the US government has been classifying and withholding information continuously now for about 80 years. And the fact that we've had to wait 80 years before scholars start to study this subject in a rigorous way using primary sources, I think is nuts. But that being the case, let's have at it. I'm going to say some critical things because I really hope and expect actually that there's going to be, I hope anyway, there's going to be a field of research now that many will be following in Alex's footsteps. But first of all, like just to try to take a step back and put this in an even broader context. Now, I completely accept, I'm convinced by Alex's argument about how it is that nuclear secrecy has its own history, and it's a profoundly important history just for secrecy more generally. There are many ways, and Alex discusses them, how it is that, were it not, for the atomic bomb, it's hard to imagine that the current, secrecy regime that we live under would have taken the shape that it has. So there are a number of important ways in which, this particular history really matters. But I'm going to show you just a few slides, in terms of what that means. That is the way in which the government reviews and then eventually releases or withholds information. I just want to show you some of the broader trends in recent years. So I'm just going to share my screen. So to begin with, I want to show you just some trends in declassification. And so the first slide here is on the left. Let me just put this in bigger form. What you're seeing here on the left is as near as the Information Security Oversight Office can estimate the total number of pages that were released through automatic and systematic declassification going back to 1979. And so in broad outline, I think you can see how there was a real boom, in the Clinton years, especially in the years 96, 97, 98. And at that point, there are over 200 million pages of documents being released each year. And since then, we've seen a veritable collapse, in the amount of information that's being released to the public. Now, notice like the high watermark, 96, 97, 98. 1998 was when the Kyle Lott Amendment was passed. Now, this was not the only reason why we see such a decline in the number of pages being released to the public, but it's a very important factor. It only has a few sentences in Alex's book, curiously enough, but this was legislation that required government officials, if they thought that a collection of documents might have restricted data, that they would have to review those pages one at a time, page by page. So just imagine what that means, when you're talking about, for instance, with the State Department, an estimated 2 billion email a year, which is what we're looking at in recent years. Or, for example, CENTCOM or the Coalition Provisional Authority. They have terabytes of email. They don't even know how many they have yet. But just imagine the logistical challenge of trying to review page by page that volume of information, especially as we transition from paper to digital records. Now, it's a little hard to know, what this represents in terms of, the larger universe of official records. But if you look on the right, you can see one particular set. These would be State Department cables from the 1970s. So these are the cables that have been released to the public. It's showing you by classification category. So in red, you see secret, in green, it's confidential, in blue, limited official use or unclassified. And the y-axis is showing you the percent of those cables that are withdrawn rather than being released to the public. And so we're getting to the point, the most recent release, which by the way was 4 years ago. It used to be they were releasing these almost annually. It's been 4 years since they released any of these cables, and they haven't released any top secret cables through this program. So in the most recent year, you can see it's approaching 50%. But interestingly, and this is where I'd point out, it's not just about state secrets. Interestingly, it's especially the category of limited official use or unclassified records that are being withheld at an even greater rate. The reason for that is most likely PII, personally identifiable information, right? So it's not just Kyle Lott, it's not just restricted data, it's also about increasingly stringent requirements for reviewing these records for the public, which is a fact that's often missed in these kinds of discussions. So I'm not positing, a unicausal explanation, for this, but nonetheless, restricted data has a huge impact more generally in terms of what gets released to the public right up to the present day. So I'm going to show you just a couple more slides. This on the left is from Alex's book. This is the declassification process in 1946. I left out the caption, but he describes this as complex. It's complex, yes, but there are only 9 boxes here, right? Look at the right. So this is from the Public Interest Declassification Board. This is the body that's meant to represent the public, all of us, right? In reviewing how it is the government decides what can be made available to the public. And this, many people think, was their greatest achievement so far. Because unfortunately, as much as they've tried to change policy, they've had a relatively limited impact. But they have shed a light into this process. And so this is showing you the process whereby documents get reviewed and in some cases released to the public at the National Declassification Center. The NDC was meant to streamline the declassification process. So this is the streamlined version. This whole area here in the middle, this is all about whether these documents have restricted data, right? So you can see how, even when we're talking about State Department cables or Pentagon documents or what have you, the possibility of restricted data presents a huge bottleneck in the declassification of records. So it's as absurd as this. You could have, this is an anecdote the National Security Archive offers, where even service records of somebody who fought in Vietnam might get reviewed page by page on the off chance that they might have schematics or something else relevant for production of nuclear grade materials or nuclear weapons, right? So let me just show you 1 or 2 more. So this is the official record of American foreign relations. This is from the State Department Office of the Historian. And what you're seeing here on the y-axis is the number of years it takes before these records get released to the public. So in this case, what we're finding is year upon year, it takes longer and longer for records to get released to the public. So we're getting now to the point where it's taking 40 years or more. Some of these volumes took more than 50 years. The most recent, what's even more discouraging, is the most recent year, there were only a total of 2 volumes released in 2020. So here again, we see almost a collapse in the processes for reviewing and releasing records to the public. Now, again, this is not all about restricted data, but RD is definitely a part of the story. This is what it means if you're an historian and you want to study the history of American foreign relations. So this is obviously not the only source you have. Historians like me, we believe in doing international multi-archival history. Christian Osterman's group has been really important in making it possible for many more historians using the Wilson Digital Archive to do multi-archival research in archives from countries around the world. But if you're interested in the official record of American foreign relations, it now amounts to some 300,000 documents that have been released ever since the Civil War. But what you can see is it takes not only longer and longer to see these documents, we have fewer and fewer of them. The last graph I want to show you is the impact this has on scholarship. So this is representing, it's a little bit complicated, so I'm gonna leave it up here while I keep talking. But this is representing all the scholarship published in the leading journal in the field of American foreign relations. It's diplomatic history. So some of my colleagues and I, what we did was we mined this textual data for the dates mentioned in these articles, because we were interested in whether the period in which historians study might in some ways reflect the amount of records that are available for that study. And what we're finding is, sure enough, if you go back to the first years of this publication, which were in the late 1970s, historians are mainly studying World War II and the early Cold War. And the years that followed, they started moving forward in time. But notice how in all this time, now going on more than some 43 years, they've only moved ahead by about 2 decades, right? So the median here is 1941, going back to the first period. The most recent period up to 2020, it's 1962. So I would argue that it's at least possible that historical research is stunted, literally, because the unavailability of sources made available through the US government, in part, to a significant extent, precisely because of the fact that they have not changed the declassification system that Alex describes, dating all the way back to 1946. And this system is collapsing under the strain of born digital data. All right, so this has an impact, right? It's important for historians, and I think it should matter to everyone if we want to know, what it is the government does in our name. Now it has, lots of effects, right? The loss of control of information the government generates, its inability to protect that information, to review it and release it to the public, has had a number of consequences, right? I'll just mention a couple just to remind us. The Hillary Clinton email scandal, I think to a great extent has to do with how it is that senior officials no longer trust the government to be able to manage and protect their information, including their personal information. And the fact that it took more than 8 months rather, to review this 30,000 batch of email is also a reflection of the collapse of our system of declassification. The fact that Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed without due diligence of the documentary record that he produced as a public official. Here again is the fact that current systems are incapable of coping with the sheer volume of materials that are produced in a timely fashion. There are various reasons for this. I would argue one of the main reasons is the gross underfunding of the National Archives. As much as public officials and our presidents talk about the need to balance, right, the requirements of secrecy with the needs for openness and transparency, there is no balance. The government now spends over $18 billion a year protecting classified information. The amount of money it devotes to declassification is about $100 million. So it's about half of 1%. So there is absolutely no balance in terms of how this government has managed information and made it available to the public. So these are really important things. I think it really matters in terms of democratic accountability, what we can know about history. And I congratulate Alex in this book. He manages to be very dispassionate and even-handed and judicious. But God damn it, Alex, where's the outrage? I mean, where's the outrage? I feel like you bury the lead in this book. I mean, you have to wait till the conclusion where Alex says that, for all of the secrecy, extreme secrecy, his educated judgment after 15 years working on this is it probably didn't slow proliferation. It probably didn't even slow the rate at which other countries acquired nuclear weapons, right? I find that outrageous. I mean, it's infuriating, that we've had these kinds of gross, consequences that go to the core of our entire system of government, and what it is we can know about history itself for a policy that failed, right? So I find that outrageous, and Alex, I hope you do too, even if you're just too judicious and maybe too smart politically in terms of who you want to convince here to fully vent your outrage. But I hope there's at least a little bit. So I'm bothered, right? But let me just offer one other criticism, if you don't mind. And this is not unique to me. It's something Kate Brown writes about in her review in Science. Now, she points out that, having read this book, you would think that it didn't matter. I'm paraphrasing. This is not exactly what she says, but you would think it didn't matter, that the people making these decisions were all of them men, all of them white, right? Now, does it matter? Now, many of you might think, if you're coming to us from outside the academy, and I think most of you are, that is this like another example of academic wokeness? Where are we now where we can't even talk about nuclear weapons, right? Without people talking about gender and race, et cetera. But actually, I think it kind of does matter. And so let me give you an example of what I had in mind. And I want to thank Kate Brown, for pointing this out, because it got me thinking a little bit harder than I might have otherwise. So as Alex describes, the Atomic Energy Act put the Federal Bureau of Investigation in charge of deciding who was going to get access to restricted data. These guys, right? So this is like a class portrait from the 1930s of men getting marksmanship training, and they're all men, right? So it wasn't until after Hoover died, he got rid of the 2 FBI agents who were women in 1924, as soon as he could. And then he didn't allow another woman to become an FBI agent until after he was dead. Now, he would talk, and he actually, and even then, in trying to justify this policy, he said that for him, what was important was that FBI agents be dominant, right? That he imagined them in a man-to-man situation as having to overpower and intimidate whoever it was that they were dealing with. Now, these were the guys, who were doing security investigations, right? Now, it wasn't just that there were no women, right? Again, they're overwhelmingly white. The FBI's own historian can only come up with 15 agents who are not white in this entire history. By 1946, there were thousands of FBI agents, like doing eventually millions of security investigations. So these were the gatekeepers of restricted data. Now, it's hard to demonstrate with data the difference that could have made, but I think there's good reasons to think it would have made a significant difference. Now, first of all, arrest record, even without conviction, could be a factor in denying somebody's security clearance. Obviously, that would disproportionately affect communities that are over-policed, like just to take one example. Now, I also have come across documents, and some of the people have written on the history of Black men and women in the American Foreign Service have given examples where people like John Foster Dulles, for example, would say, you know, as much as I might like to appoint a Black person to the UN delegation, they're just never going to get a security clearance, right? So sometimes this is a factor even in terms of who was not getting chosen for particular jobs, not just like who didn't get those jobs because they couldn't get security clearances. Now, Alex references, you know, how it is that sympathy for civil rights causes could be a red flag, right? And the NAACP, as we know, was getting investigated throughout this period. Now, I think that probably matters, right? To some extent in terms of who these people are and who gets to wield this incredible power that Alex describes. Now, one of the only studies I was able to find where they actually tracked ethnic and racial discrimination in security clearances comes from the Department of Energy. Interestingly enough, from 1994. Now, why is that? Why is it that only the Department of Energy, after all these years in 1994, decides this is something they should look at? That it was something they'd never looked at before. And apparently the people in this report say that they were surprised themselves when they found this. What did they find? They found that clearances, you know, for African Americans, Hispanics, American Indians were suspended more often than would be statistically expected if the suspensions had been randomly distributed across racial and ethnic groups. Why is it the Department of Energy? Why 1994? Because I think, because Hazel O'Leary is this energy secretary, the first woman, the first Black woman to be Secretary of Energy, right? So Alex, to his credit, you know, in the book, I think it's one of the only times he points out, you know, whether anybody had any particular gender or any particular race, he points out that Hazel O'Leary was the first woman, the first Black to be Secretary of Energy. And he said that, you know, she looked different. But again, it's not just that she looked different, right? I think it's about who she was and her experience, right? That probably shaped her understanding of the problem that she confronted. I think these things mattered in terms of the fact that the Department of Energy, for the first time, you know, opened up the files for experimentation on human subjects. I think it mattered in terms of more generally how it is the DOE in that period began to open their files. And of course, it mattered in terms of how she was targeted, right? And eventually, at least to some extent, driven out of office, allegedly because of the security breaches where Asian Americans allegedly were a particular threat. So this part of the history, Alex, I hope you would agree, like, is also a part of this history. It also has to be explored and investigated. And I don't expect you all to have done all of that in what is already a monumental and incredibly impressive book. But I hope anyway that there's a field of research now where many more will join with you in exploring this subject. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt, as we get back to the full screen for this very thoughtful and passionate commentary. Alex, over to you for an initial response, and then we'll go to our long list of people who would like to intervene as well. So, Alex.
Thank you so much, Matt. I think your bigger point that the difficulty of writing this history is partially because the subject matter is closed off, and at least writing it well, right? It's easy to write a one-sided history of secrecy from the outside, but that isn't there's going to be major limitations in that. And that's partially why I don't spend as much time in the 90s as I really wish I could in this book. That and the publisher putting hard page count restrictions. But I do think it's really important. I think Kyle Lott is important, but in the sort of way in which I see it, it's important in its sort of, the book in its details is much shorter in the 90s because there's many, I had some access to things that had once been official use only but had been released. But anything that's still classified, they're not going to release it anytime soon. So that put real limitations. And I try to signal that in the book and say, look, there's only so much you can say after a certain point. But, and as your chart shows, you know, the richest material in the book covers from about 45 through the late 70s. That's where you have lots of stuff to go on. And even the 80s are difficult. You can do some stuff from the outside from the 80s, but it's very hard to do stuff from the inside. So that's definitely part of it. And it's part of this book. And I have to own up to that because that's part of the book, right? There's no way around that without access to more stuff. I think that in terms of your question though, about like, where's the outrage? I don't know. I have an easy time. My goal of doing this book is not to, it is to produce something that could be useful for people performing, and it is to make commentary on the value of the secrecy and things like that. But more of it, it's been just trying to get inside the head of the people making the secrecy. And I find that if I go into it with a strong view of looking for the bad guys and looking for the evil, that I end up writing a bad history. I'm fine to bury the lead. To me, writing something that is, on the one hand, somewhat sympathetic to what they think they're doing, and then in the end concluding it was pointless, is not a bad history book. It's not going to. The goal is not to get people to go out and do something. I'm more than happy if people want to take the book and hold it up and say, go out and do something. That's totally fine by me. But that's not what I see my job as doing, not at least for this book. I'm not an anti-secrecy activist. And I think that doesn't mean that I think secrecy is good, but I don't really consider myself that way. And I think that this book would have been very hard to write, at least to write well, as an anti-secrecy activist. And I say this with no disrespect whatsoever to anti-secrecy activists, some of whom are good friends of mine, but that isn't my particular object, so to speak. And to the question of like, does it matter? Of course it matters. Of course it does. And it matters not only that they're white and male, which is omnipresent in the Cold War, but it matters that a lot of them are scientists. That colors how they view all sorts of matters. And one of my biggest arguments is that the fact that the DOE had been so physicist dominated, and the Atomic Energy Commission is one of the reasons it handles secrecy so poorly, because physicists turn out to be experts in many things, but not governmental operations and not, the complexities of practical systems and things like that. And yeah, you could imagine this book having a lot more. There is some stuff on there on the ways in which these conversations are limited to a certain number of people, but that's sort of what a secrecy system is, right? It's deliberately a system of exclusion. Who's on the inside, who's on the outside. And it struck me as sort of not, as a little obvious to say, like, guess what? During most of the Cold War, it was white guys inside the nuclear weapons system. Like, well, I mean, yeah, that's this is a racist, sexist society, and especially on these areas where they were thinking they were drawing the walls up as high as possible, like nuclear weapons, they were going to be extremely that way. They wouldn't even, I guess, as you point out, they not only didn't tolerate minorities and women for the most part, they didn't tolerate people who had heretical ideas like, at one point, international control. Like this Lilienthal in particular, David Lilienthal, head of the Atomic Energy Commission, was amazed that late in his tenure, people being interested in international control, a policy he had triumphed and pushed, were now being seen as like red flags for dangerous ideas. But that's how constricted it gets, right? So I think the question of would it have mattered if it was different is a little hard to answer because it's ahistorical. You can't just take a bunch of women and minorities and plunk them into 1950s America, high positions of government, and like have any clue what that would look like. The system that produced that would be different. I will point out though that Hazel Leary was definitely the first African-American woman. She was not the first woman though. Dixie Lee Ray in the 1970s under Nixon was a female chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And as with all of these examples, huh?
She gets a footnote.
I know, because I felt bad about that. She doesn't do that much on secrecy one way or the other. And the problem with a book like this, with keeping it, as you know from writing books, within the scope, every little part of it has to be about like what's changing the baseline. And so Dixie Lee Ray, there's a few other characters in there who just get like shoved into a footnote at best. Yeah, this person was the head of it for 2 years. Well, anyway, they were a lawyer. Moving on. But they also just didn't do they didn't, what I would say, make a big mark on the policy, which is to say, especially after the first 3 or 4 people in that role, most of the people running the AEC don't seem interested in reforming or changing the system one way or the other. They accept it as the status quo and they become as boring as most bureaucrats do. And Hazel O'Leary is interesting because she's the only one after all that who actually totally bucks the system and changes things around. And I do try to talk about why she's doing that and what her motivating things are. And I do think that makes a big difference. I don't think you get the openness initiative without Hazel O'Leary and being who she is, being interested in what she is. She's not a sort of cold warrior the way that most of them were. She isn't James Schlesinger. She isn't, you know, these types of people. So I definitely think it matters. I think it makes a difference. But again, it'd be nice to have written that book also. That was kind of my feeling when I read Kate Brown's review, is I thought, well, it'd be nice to have written that. That's a different book, and I hope somebody writes it, because it even telling the old white guy version of the story, which I admit that's what most of my people are, was hard enough. And telling the sort of broader, especially the period again of the 90s to the present, that's something that I can't do as well as I'd like to, at least not with the methods I use. The best approach to that I know of is Arkin and Priest's Top Secret America, which is a good book. Most of it's 9/11 afterwards, but is you know, it's a work of sort of journalism, and that's sort of, and it's limited by what it can access as well, of course. But this was what I struggled with in doing the book. There's part of me that wanted to do a whole additional, you know, would have wanted to really spend a lot more time on the late Cold War, and especially the end of the Cold War. And in the end, I thought, well, this is probably about as good as I can make it do for this amount of space and with these sources. But I agree, and I share your optimism and hope that there will be a lot of other things, and I hope that there will be a burgeoning field, including people who will see my book as the one that you need to respond to and show how wrong it is. That would be excellent. But and I say in the introduction of the book, this, despite the title, I mean, the title is The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States, and my publisher said, this is what we would like the subtitle to be. And I bet you're going to want to change it to A History of Nuclear Secrecy, because that's how you historians always are. And I was like, well, I mean, intellectually speaking, obviously, but I understand you've got to sell some books, and that's a complicated, the title is going to be what it is. So I would not actually represent it as the history, but it is a history, and it's a start, I think. But anyway, I agree with these things. I'm also don't have a problem with people being outraged at all. If you want to be outraged after reading the book, that's in my opinion, a 100% valid interpretation of the book. Though that's not really, I don't go into it for the outrage or whatever. And again, for me, in a way, it's easier to be outraged than it is to show that the reason that it got into this situation isn't because of a lot of people conspiring. It got into it in part because some very well-intentioned people were trying to feel their way through this new world and these new ideas, and then ended up getting themselves into systems that they couldn't undo themselves. And to me, the great irony of the book, especially the beginning, the part 1 and part 2 of the book, is that most of the people who end up setting up this system are effectively not fans of secrecy. They build this prison for themselves and then realize belatedly that they can't get out of it. And some of them end up saying, like Lilienthal, like, well, we should just disbar the entire AEC. It's a terrible organization by the 60s. But by that point, it's too late.
Great. Well, let's open it up. Thanks, Alex, for that response. And that was just a wonderful exchange. And Matt and Kathleen, please feel free to chime into the discussion with the audience as well. I think, Eric, you had a quick initial question as well.
I do. We've talked about big issues in our exchange now. In addition to the big issues, there are also some really quite excellent stories that, as readers, I think draw us into the issues and the larger narrative that you're constructing. And you haven't talked, given our time constraints, about some of those really quite excellent stories. I'm wondering if you could just talk for just a moment or two about the Progressive Magazine case in 1979, in an effort to stop a leftist magazine from publishing what government lawyers think are highly problematic content, yet the lawyers themselves disagree and come to question and challenge the fact that they're even bringing this case at all. And so maybe if you could just say a few things about that and how it touches these larger issues.
We do have many people waiting, so Alex, please be real succinct.
I will say that the book is mostly little stories and narrative anecdotes, and that's how I write, and it's what I find fun about this. And yeah, you lose that in this kind of discussion. I thought you were going to ask about a different story, but I'll just mention briefly that as it came to mind as one of the places in the book where I do have some non-white people, which is a bunch of Indian scientists who sort of wander into the Manhattan Project. And there, the fact that they are non-American and non-white does play a big deal, a difference in how the security people interact with them. But I'll just throw that out there. The progressive case is fascinating, and I end up spending quite a lot of the book talking about it because it's just so much is going on. But basically, it's an anti-war, anti-secrecy activist named Howard Moreland, and he decides that the way to take down the secrecy system and to be a powerful actor is to discover and then publish how an H-bomb is made. And he goes about this in various ways. And I think I note in the book, maybe I don't, but one of the amusing things is he takes this plan to a number of other anti-nuclear activists, including many women. And they say, like, what is this idea? What is your plan? You're going to show people how to make an H-bomb and somehow that's going to fix the secrecy system? Like, this isn't how activism works. And he is, does it anyway. And he takes it to a magazine, The Progressive, and left-wing magazine, as you'd imagine from the title. And they agree to publish it, but they basically bait the government into trying to censor them. And I think the baiting part is something that hadn't really been discussed in most histories of the progressive discussion, that it's very deliberate. It's not the government being a big ogre as it gets depicted and like, squash the progressive. It's they sort of, through ways I described, force the government into a very uncomfortable position where they decide they're going to try to use this law. They don't really expect the progressive to fight back. The progressive does fight back. It ends up in court and then in appeals court. And then in the course of this case, it becomes clear that the government's approach to trying to censor this information is trying to censor information that's really been out there for many years in little bits and pieces. And all Moreland really did is sort of pull it together. And I talked to some of the lawyers on the case, and it was also one of these instances where the version that became the sort of public version is mean government is dumb and wants to censor nice guy activist. But the reality was more like lawyers recognized very quickly this is a bad case. The Attorney General, however, had made a promise to the President of the United States, Carter, in order to prosecute it. They did not think that they were being the bad guys. They thought they were being the good guys, the anti-Nixon reforms, and they thought how to make an H-bomb was a suitable benchmark for how dangerous a secret had to be before you could censor it. And in the end, the whole thing falls apart. I spend a lot of time on it in the book, but I'm pretty pleased with it as a bit of research, not just because I got access to some of these people, but it is one of these cases where seeing both sides of it really lets you sort of figure out what's gone wrong here. Is it that the government overreach is so large, or is it that there's these systems of power that are moving around that are not always in communication with each other? And then again, I don't want to call the progressive people bad faith actors, but they are sort of bad faith actors, are able to take advantage of this system in a way that amplifies, ironically, uses secrecy to amplify their own voice considerably.
All right, let's go to Michael Binder. If you could please unmute yourself and introduce yourself briefly and ask your very brief question.
Sure. I was a DOE reviewer for 4 years. I've been an Air Force reviewer for 16 years. I guess this question is more for Professor Connolly. Do you want to have information declassified or records declassified, sanitized? Because those are two very different things, and you really have to make a choice as to which one we will focus on.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if, for instance, performance is measured quantitatively, you create perverse incentives. So just to take an example, the statistics I was showing about pages declassified, the number I gave for the amount spent to protect government information, the most recent information is 2017. Because the Information Security Oversight Office says that they no longer feel they can have confidence in the estimates provided by departments and agencies about the number of pages they're declassifying, the number of secrets they're producing each year, and the amount of money they're spending on secrecy. So in effect, I wouldn't want, to set quantitative goals, or even in terms of like time limitation. So when, for instance, we talk about automatic declassification, one of my concerns is that, if you say that a record has to be released, after X number of years, you create an incentive potentially to destroy records, right, rather than release them. So to answer your question, we want the information, right? And if, instead we're just looking at numbers of records, right, or even how old those records are, what we may get is a lot of dreck, that nobody's interested in. So the declassification policy, if I understand your question, should be informed by an understanding of what it is the public needs to know, right? More so than, we're going to declassify this many records, say. But we're failing on all fronts, by the way, whether it's about information or whether it's about numbers of records released.
Thank you. Alex?
I just might add to that, that to me, and this is one of the things that I really agree with you on, Matt, that in terms of like what could be done, number one thing that could be done is funding more and more of there's records that by law, they contain information in them that should be out, right? That the act of declassification is not actually deciding that something shouldn't be secret anymore. That's a separate system. It's going through records that already exist and deciding whether or not you can release them now. And in principle, there's millions of records out there that by our current legal standards should be released and should have information out there. And the fact that they're not is not, again, I don't think it's because of shadowy cabals, but I do think it's because we don't fund this, especially at National Archives. The backlogs at NARA are so bad that it's almost not worth filing FOIA requests at this point. It'll take you 5 years before they even review your request practically. And so like, to me, the answer would be yes, all of the above, and please 10 times more. Can we please just dedicate a lot more funding to this and make that a bipartisan issue? Because that would free up a lot of that would rectify a lot of the ills when it comes to, say, being a historian. Even if I get a record and a bunch of the words are deleted, I can still use that as a historian. But if I don't have a record, I can't do anything. Except guess.
Thank you. Let me call on Toshi Higuchi. Toshi?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, great. Alex, congratulations. I look forward to reading your book. I have a question.
Introduce yourself, Toshi, real quick.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my name is Toshi Higuchi from Georgetown University. So you might touch on this in your book, but I wonder if you can enlighten me a little bit about the transnational transfer and the learning of the American ideas and practices of nuclear secrecy and its impact on democracy around the world. Now, I'm thinking more about the British here because obviously that's a case like weapons information has been shared. But I'm also thinking about the Japanese case, which is not really about nuclear secrecy, but more like a defense information provided by the United States that led to the crisis in post-war democracy because of the increased police power. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Toshi. It's good to hear from you. So the book talks a little bit about this, but not as much as I would like. To me, this is would require another book probably. But there are some discussions about the US and the UK in particular, because these are obviously very close. They're both very close in their nuclear programs, and they also have some problems with the UK being responsible for the most major spy in the Manhattan Project. And so there were several very tense years from the 40s and the 50s as this sort of relationship was getting reworked out again. And the US was trying to sort of make sure that the British standards were considered to be adequate to the US ones. The really interesting case, and I talk about it a little bit in the chapter that talks about gas centrifuges, is trying to deal with the British, the German, and the Dutch with regard to centrifuges. And John Kriega's work and Bill Burr's work has looked at this a bit as well. And to me, it's really interesting. In a way, we think about secrecy as being about our enemies. but it's often about our allies. And so is a lot of our nuclear policy, right? We need our allies to be enlisted with us on certain things. And our allies are in some ways more tricky than our enemies because, you know what the Soviets are going to do. It's pretty straightforward, right? Whereas, like, what are the Dutch going to do? That's actually a pretty difficult question. And so the US tries to export certain secrecy rules and expectations to the Netherlands regarding centrifuges that were not developed in the United States. They didn't get any restricted data from the United States, but they had been judged to have data that they think is somewhat sensitive. And the Dutch were very resistant about this. And the Dutch basically said, we don't want to import a secrecy system. We don't really have one. We definitely don't want yours. And also, you're not the boss of us, and this isn't your information, so why should you get to tell us? And eventually the Dutch agreed to sort of adopt some of these practices. But from what I can tell, I'm not an expert on the Dutch stuff, but even just from what I can tell about what you can research on the Dutch side of things, they definitely don't adopt them as strongly. I mean, some of the copies, I have the copies of those secrecy agreements, which are not declassified in the United States, but the Dutch will release them to anybody. And this is the kind of asymmetry that, of course, a historian can happily exploit. But it's also a sign that this really didn't work that well. So again, I think there's a lot more. I don't really know that much about the exporting of these things in the Japanese case at all. And I think I would probably find the language difficulties impossible. So I'm hoping that somebody else can write that. Oh, I think you're still muted, Christian.
I'm sorry. Thanks, Toshi and Alex. We'll go to Joyce Rangan next. Joyce, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, you're still muted, Joyce.
You should be prompted to unmute yourself. Can we get this fixed? No, then maybe we'll try back later and go to Jeffrey Gruber.
Hello, hi.
Yes, hi. We can hear you. Please introduce yourself and ask a question.
And now I'm at King's College London.
Great.
So hello from the future. It's 10 p.m. here. Kathleen brought up a really interesting point that I learned from Alex's book about the driving fears and motivation for secrecy in the Manhattan Project, which was that Congress was really the most likely to shut down the project. I found it interesting when Truman later on in April 1945, when Roosevelt died, he beforehand as a senator was really trying to study the project, and he was always thwarted. But then afterwards, and when he finally was let in on the secret, his reaction was that, quotes, he understood now perfectly why he was thwarted. So my question is, considering Truman's reaction, was it a reasonable or valid fear of Congress?
Yeah, I think so. So the argument in the book is right that one of the major targets of the secrecy during the World War II period was keeping the American Congress in the dark. Not so much because the American Congress is full of bad people, but because they leak all the time and they might not be able to accept that this project was a good idea, and they could actually shut it down, whereas, say, the Germans or the Soviets or the Japanese would not be able to. And I think, yeah, I think it's actually totally valid fear. Congress leaks information all the time. They do it during the Cold War. They do it during World War II. There's very few means by which to punish congressmen who leaks information. So they don't have a lot of disincentives to do it. Truman himself, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. I mean, he tried as a senator to audit the project. And he did, in fact, get a little bit of information on it. And and we know this because he wrote to a judge shortly after he was told not to look, that they were building some kind of explosive out at Hanford. And so somebody leaked to Truman some kind of information about it. And of course, he did exactly what people feared that he might do, which is he immediately leaks it to a civilian, right? He immediately passes that information along in open mail to somebody who has no connection. So I do think, and let me just say that just because I think that they had valid reasons for doing it, it doesn't make it a good thing. I think that at some level, the Manhattan Project is a fundamentally anti-democratic approach. And I think that secrecy, especially on that level, is fundamentally at odds with democracy. And the tricky thing to do is to reconcile, okay, maybe it's fundamentally anti-democracy, but is there another way that they could have made the bomb during World War II? And I don't think so. And so to me, this is one of those things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing at all, but I think about this every time I hear somebody saying we need a new Manhattan Project for X or a new Manhattan Project for Y. You really don't want a lot of organizations like the Manhattan Project. They're very bad for democracy. And if that's your only option, if being totally secretive and ramming a program through is the only possibility with no oversight, okay, maybe you need that to survive, okay, but you should be really hesitant to go down that path. Don't call for a new Manhattan Project for faster internet. It's not worth it.
Thank you. Alex, on the Manhattan Project, John Cloud wrote in a question, your research is as usual spot on. He writes, but did the secrecy protocols really begin at the beginning of the Manhattan Project, or did the protocols borrow and absorb pre-existing protocols from industrial secrecy, particularly large-scale industrial chemistry and munitions and many other weapon systems between the wars?
Yeah, it's a great question. And with anything historical, you can always find an antecedent. There's nothing new under the sun. In the US, you do have some technical secrecy during World War I. You really don't have a lot before World War I. And that to me is quite interesting. Secrecy and on the scale that we think of it is mostly a 20th century creation. World War I is sort of the beginnings of that with the Espionage Act and some other laws that are passed around this time, and fears of submarines and gas warfare. It's on a much more partial scale. It's not as large. And they end most of it after the war ends. That's the sort of big difference between World War I and World War II, is that most of that World War I secrecy is sort of rolled back immediately, and is what many of the participants in World War II thought was going to happen. But yeah, there are some antecedents there, and it's not a coincidence that some of the people who end up being very important for the establishment of the secrecy of the Manhattan Project have ties to that world. So James Conant, who was he was the president of Harvard, a major scientific administrator during the war, played a big role in suggesting how secrecy ought to work in the sort of civilian secrecy phase of the bomb work. He had, during World War I, worked at a top secret factory to develop, top secret didn't exist then, but a secret factory to develop chemical weapons that were never used by the United States because the war ended before they were ready. They dumped them off the coast of Baltimore, as one does. But to me, it's not a coincidence that people from that era, this sort of World War I experience of secrecy and defense work, they become the powerful people in the beginning of World War II, and they're the ones who start really setting up this system of compartmentalization and isolated sites and security clearances and things like that. They're borrowing it. What happens during World War II is that all that gets amplified to a much larger level than it was in World War I. Many, many, many more people are absorbed by the secrecy, and then it doesn't go away at the end of the war.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time here. Let's call on a couple more folks. Stephen Schwartz, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the speakers.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Alex. Hi, Kathleen. Stephen Schwartz, non-resident senior fellow at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Alex, what would you say? I mean, you've been delving into this field for, it feels like decades, I'm sure, a long time. What do you think is the most egregious misuse of nuclear secrecy that you've uncovered, both, in the prelude to this book and then actually putting the book officially together? How did the government officials justify it, and what were its immediate and long-term impacts on the US nuclear weapons program, the course of the Cold War, and American society?
It's a really hard question to answer, Stephen, but I thank you for asking it. If I was going to say real misuse, not just there's uses of secrecy that maybe they had bad effects, but you could see them as being valid, like the sizes of the stockpile, right? Which that had huge impacts on how Americans thought about nuclear weapons that were vastly out of sync at times from the reality of the situation. But you could see why they wanted to keep that secret, right? I wouldn't necessarily call that a misuse, it's a use. But if I was gonna say real misuse in terms of it didn't really get that much and it really was inappropriate, I think that the easiest one to name, and it has the most interesting story, is the plutonium experiments. So this was work that was done during World War II. The goal was to figure out how plutonium, whether it's, it's a toxic radioactive substance, how it interacted with the human body so that they could establish safety tolerances for the plants. And the fact that they did it under secrecy and without informed consent, that's bad enough, though you can see why they did the research. That's not the way you're supposed to do research, but you can see why they did it. And as far as we can tell, nobody was injured by it. The amounts of plutonium were not very large, but it's still totally unethical way of going about the research. But the secrecy of it that's interesting is the post-war secrecy. So when the atomic energy, this was done by the Manhattan Project. When the Atomic Energy Commission came into power, they learned about this, and this was taken to David Lilienthal, and they said, should we release this? There's no national security reason to keep this under wraps. It's just very distasteful, and as they said it seems a little Nuremberg-y, right? It's not appropriate. And Lilienthal, no fan of secrecy at all, saw himself as a reformer, said, we better keep it secret. And the reasoning was that if you made that sort of misuse of activities public, that this would be used as a weapon against the Atomic Energy Commission, that its political enemies would not differentiate between work that had been done under the Army in the Manhattan Project and by the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission. And at that moment, the Atomic Energy Commission was politically very weak, and Lilienthal feared, not totally incorrectly, that if there was a major scandal like this, it could be used as a way to disband civilian control of nuclear weapons and production, and that would lead to a whole terrible apocalyptic situation he didn't want. And so this was kept secret until the 1990s, when it got released as part of the Openness Initiative, and had major impacts on how people felt about whether they could trust the government and the DOE. It had scandalous problems even in the 90s when it came out, because it's that bad of a thing. And I like it as an example because it is a terrible misuse of secrecy. It's not done, again, because the people doing it are these sort of evil people. It's because they're real people in a mixed up, terrible world. And I can understand that. And my favorite thing about Lilienthal, and the reason why I spend a lot of time on him in the book, is he's so flawed. He's so human. He really wants to do the right thing, but he finds it, because of his context, almost impossible to do so. And to me, that's a reflection on the human condition in a really important way.
Thank you, Alex. Question that came through the chat. Patricia McMahon is asking about research materials you used. In particular, she writes, I'm curious about the existence of the underlying documentation for the secret intelligence reports that might have survived and is housed in archives. I'm thinking about the card catalogs of information or even surveillance records. Have you seen any of this underlying source material, and where might it be found if it still exists? Quick answer, please.
Yeah, I don't know 100% about the record you're talking about, but in general, lots of archival work, lots of national archives, sometimes having to do things that are rather clever with the finding aids, like finding collections that they didn't make a finding aid for, but they did create a listing of where the boxes are and just requesting boxes blind. Some Freedom of Information Act requests, some mandatory declassification requests. One of the reasons this book took a long time to write, and this relates to Matthew's criticisms of the current system as well, is that none of these systems are quick. They're very slow, and you can get things out of them if you're willing to wait 5-10 years to do it. And fortunately, some of these requests that I put in 1 million years ago did come to pass and allow me to write some of these sections that are in the book about things that were otherwise would have been impossible to sort of tell the story of. So in the back of the book are extensive notes, and if you're looking for specific research, you or anyone else, advice, you're more than welcome to email me, and I can tell you what I have and don't have. One of the things that I do, I think, fairly well, and there are some historians who are doing things like this now, and Matthew is one of the people who's sort of at the cutting edge of this, but is using computers to help improve our speed in these things, and not just taking all the notes on index cards in the ways of yore. And one of the things that I have for my own work is I have lots of finding age digitized, including ones that are paper only, lots of databases, things like that. So if anybody is got pressing questions, feel free to send them my way. I'll tell you anything I've got, because I just can't stop talking.
Great, thank you. Irvin Binder has been patiently waiting. He'll be our last question for you. Please unmute yourself, short introduction and question, and then an even shorter answer from Alex.
All right, I'm a Dr. Binder. I worked in the Department of Energy for quite a number of years doing document reviews. And I do have a number of things I'd like to follow up with, but in particular, I happen to disagree with your emphasis on secrecy, because in my work on document reviews, it was as important for me to release documents as it was to protect documents. And I challenged many of the people from whom I was doing document reviews, why do we need to protect this? I think rather than talking about secrecy, you should be talking about information control. And I often, or there were a number of times where I said, you know, we don't need to protect this anymore. This is already either obvious or we've already released this information. So this particular rule to classify it, we don't need it anymore. I think you're overreaching when you put the emphasis only on secrecy and not on the work that we also did in parallel to make information available to the citizens of the United States.
Thank you very much, Alex.
You will be so pleased, Erwin, because chapter 5 is all about information control and where that concept comes from and how it works. And I just want to emphasize that the book is about both restriction and about release. And this is what I mean by sort of restoring some of the views of the censor. From the outside, the censor looks like someone who merely crosses things out. On the inside, there are people, as you speak, who are trying to put things out and trying to release. And especially within the Early Atomic Energy Commission, this is the cardinal debate. How much do you try to hold back? How much do you have to release? What are the pros and cons of each of them? And I would say that the one caveat I would put, to me fully agreeing with you, is that where that emphasis is, release versus retention, that varies historically. And there are times in this history in which the emphasis is on put out as much as you can. The 90s are a key time. The early 70s are a key time for this. And then there are times, and you know, Matthew was pointing out the Kyle Lott as one of those examples, the late 90s, the sort of later 70s, where it flips back the other direction. And there's and there's reasons for why it flips beyond people changing their mind on what's secret, but political incentives. And in general, it's easy to get punished for releasing too much information, but you'll never get punished for holding too much back. So I agree with you. It's both sides of the story. And the book has both of these things in it. It tries to actually argue that they are two sides of the same coin, as opposed to sort of polar opposites.
Thank you. Well, with apologies to those who we did not have time to call on, with thanks to Alex, Kathleen, and Matt, I'll turn the floor over to Eric for concluding remarks. Eric.
Yes, my thanks to all of you as well. Please join us next week on Monday, May 17th at 4 p.m. when we return to discuss Joanne Meyerowitz's just published book, A War on Global Poverty, The Lost Promise of Redistribution and the Rise of Microcredit. Good night and take care.